Hello, this is Dave Hurwitz, Executive Editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with 4 sequels to Beethoven's last piano sonata. That is the Sonata in C minor, number 32, Opus 111. Now, this is a remarkable work, Beethoven's last sonata, because it only has 2 movements. The first movement is a sonata allegro, a turbulent, dramatic movement, and the second is the famous arietta, which is a theme in variations. It's marked molto, adagio, and expressive, and fabulous, and glorious, and all of that stuff, the way Beethoven's late music tends to be excessively marked with expressive indications. And it's an incredible movement. It plays, depending on repeats, anywhere from 13 or 14 minutes to about 18 or 19 minutes. And you really should take all the repeats, by the way. And it's an extraordinary creation because although it's marked adagio, it actually speeds up as it goes because the note values get smaller until it just dissolves into trills and the entire piece just floats away. It's amazing. It's an absolutely amazing creation. And the sonata generally represents, in its most pure form, Beethoven's obsession in his last period with the contrast between drama and rhetoric, between the dramatic expression of sonata form and the more declamatory and rhetorical expression of contrapuntal and variation forms, which, as you know, are not dramatic because the variations are sectional and fugues are structural, architectural. And this was his obsession, without a doubt. You can hear it in all of his late music. I mean, there are the fugues in the Ninth Symphony, there are the fugues in the string quartet, and then it all culminates. It all culminates in what they call in the music biz the big fugue, known in German as the grosse Fuge, the gigantic fugue thing for string quartet that became a detached movement, even though it was originally the last movement of a string quartet because it was so big and so crazy. But in this sonata, you're dealing with a sonata allegro form and a variation form, and that's the contrast. And to have only 2 movements it wasn't so unusual in piano sonatas, but to have a sonata of this size, because the thing plays for, practically half an hour. I mean, 27, 28 minutes typically is quite unusual. However, there were some sequels, and those sequels are fascinating. But the first thing I want to do is just mention the fact that when we did our survey of Beethoven's sonata cycles, there we go, some of the commentators said, well, you should have mentioned Backhouse. So here he is, Backhouse. And some others said, well, you should have mentioned Richard Good. So here he is, Richard Good. I have this, I could surround myself with Beethoven sonata cycles and live in the interior of the stack. But I do have them. They're wonderful. I love them. If you want them included in the survey of Beethoven sonata cycles, by all means, put them in there. But let's talk about some other works written, something like 100 years later, at least, and not even sonatas, but rather symphonies. There are 2 symphonies that follow the pattern that Beethoven outlined in his final piano sonata almost exactly, almost to the letter. I'm not talking about copying the music or copying the individual variations, but rather in the broader structure. That is an initial sonata allegro movement and then a big variation finale. It's fascinating. It's fascinating to see what these great composers did with this outline that Beethoven provided. And the first and the most fascinating in some ways is Prokofiev. And specifically, Prokofiev in his Second Symphony. Now, the Second Symphony is maybe, the least popular of all the Prokofiev symphonies. I mean, nobody plays it. It was a piece that he said was going to be made of fire and steel or ice and stone or rock and baggage or eggplant and parmesan. I don't know. He had some line about how tough and gnarly it is. And it is tough and gnarly, but, as always with Prokofiev, the tough and gnarly kind of conceals the melodic core because he was a genius as a melodist. Here, listen to the opening. I'm going to play the opening of the Kuchar performance here on Naxos. There are really two great Prokofiev cycles, Kuchar's and Yarvi's on Naxos, and they're both thrilling. I mean, the opening of this symphony is such a gross, a big fuck you is what it is. It really is in Prokofiev's terms, but then you'll see it very quickly settles down to a tune. But it's wonderfully exciting. Here it is. Now, there you go. Isn't that a great thing to put on your ringtone? I mean, I have it as a ringtone. You might, and whenever that thing goes off, I can't even use it that often because whenever that thing goes off, it sounds like, air raid sirens or fire alarms or something like that. But the second movement is indeed a big, long, like 20-minute long theme and variations, full of fantasy and imagination on an original theme, and the piece, just like the Beethoven, becomes increasingly vaporous until it evaporates fantastically at the very, very end. And that's probably the reason that the symphony doesn't ever get played, because it ends quietly and mysteriously. But, oh, what a wonderful piece it is, and what a great opportunity, if you know the Beethoven, to use it as a gateway into the gnarlier, more obnoxious world of the Prokofiev Second Symphony. I mean, he was trying to make a statement, and he did, and I love it. I just love it, and maybe you will too. The other Second Symphony, in fact, all of these works are Second Symphonies. I have no idea how that happened, but we're going to be talking about 4 of them, and they are all Second Symphonies, one and all, is Szymanowski. This is extraordinary, this piece. It really is, because, no one ever talks about it. I mean, Szymanowski never even talked about it, particularly. This is in 2 movements, a Sonata Allegro first movement, and a theme and variation second movement, just like the Beethoven Sonata. Only here, the variation movement ends with a fugue, so that it attains a natural, not as you call it natural, everything in variation forms is pre-planned, but it attains a satisfying climax by having something large and structural. I mean, the reason so many variation sets end with fugues is just for that reason, because the form is sectional, and you want to round it off by something that gives the whole thing a shape and a structure and an important and impressive culminating statement. And so the Second Symphony ends like that. I'm going to play you a bit of the scherzando variation from the second movement, so you get a sense of what it sounds like. This, by the way, is a marvelous performance by the Warsaw Philharmonic under Anthony Witt, who's done all the Szymanowski stuff. And, I praised Simon Rattle's Szymanowski, which is wonderful, but he never did the Second Symphony. And you can easily get these Witt recordings on Naxos, and they are superb. So here's the scherzando variation from the finale. Delightful, isn't it? the piece itself, Szymanowski's style at this point, it's his early style of the first decade in the 20th century, was very Richard Straussian, only sort of more chromatic. And so, when you listen to the whole symphony, you'll be struck by the richness of the string textures and those somewhat Straussian, some might say even cloying harmonies once in a while. But it's a rewarding work, an interesting work, and one that never, ever, ever gets played. It's unbelievable. Adol Dorati made a recording of it. There have been a few, mostly from Polish sources, but it's a remarkable work that is clearly based on the structure of Beethoven's final piano sonata. Now, the next two symphonies that we're going to talk about are a little bit one step more removed. Why? Because they culminate more or less in large variation movements. I mean, the point of these is that the big variation movement is the big movement in the symphony after the sonata allegro movement. And so you might say they're influenced by Beethoven at one remove. Of course, there are always symphonies that end with theme and variation movements. I mean, Dvorak's Eighth is one of them, and Haydn wrote several. In the Romantic period, though, there are very, very few. I mean, you might call the Passacaglia in the finale of Brahms' Fourth a variation movement because, it is a variation movement of a type. But there aren't many. There really aren't many. And so it's very striking that these symphonies include these huge variation movements, which arguably take the structure that Beethoven outlined in his last piano sonata one step further. One of these symphonies is Franz Schmidt's Second Symphony. This is Nimi Yarvi's recording with the Chicago Symphony on Chandos, and it's clearly the best. Vasily Sinaisky also did a very good one on Naxos with the Malmö Symphony Orchestra. Do not get the Vienna Philharmonic recording on Sony under Bitchkov. It is very tame and underplayed for some reason. But this is a gorgeous work. No one plays it. No one ever plays it. I don't know why. It's a fabulous, lovely, decadent, late Romantic masterpiece. It really is. Now, the Schmidt Symphony actually has three movements. It has a sonata allegro first movement, a big, huge, long, central theme and variation movement that lasts like 20 minutes, and then a finale. But the finale really acts sort of as a coda to the whole work because of the cyclical and recapitulatory elements that it contains. And so you can argue in a way that it's kind of the logical culmination of the two previous movements. I don't know if you need to make that argument. It's a wonderful work anyway, and I wanted an excuse to talk about it. And this seemed as good as any because of the presence of that huge theme and variations in the middle. So it has a very well balanced form because the finale is basically as long as the first movement, and the most highly developed and complex, as in the Beethoven, is the variation movement, the central movement in that case. However, if you want to talk about a symphony that looks like a normal symphony but then has a huge variation finale, consider Dohnányi's Second Symphony. This is the BBC Philharmonic with Matthias Bamert, also on Chandos. A very, very interesting piece. It was composed after the Second World War. It's in Dohnányi's late Romantic style. It has the normal four movements, but it ends with a big 20-minute long variation movement, which is based on a Bach chorale. I mean, it's really doing the Beethovenish German variation thing, shall we say, at the end. And it's tremendously rewarding. It really is. The earlier movements are all, of moderate length, say 10, 11 minutes for the first two, the opening sonata movement, then there's a slow movement, then there's a very short scherzo, a burlesque, like Mahler's Rondo Burlesque. It's less than 5 minutes long, which is full of snap and bitterness and anger. And then the whole thing is resolved in this sequence of variations on the Bach chorale, which is how the piece finally ends. I think this is a remarkable piece of music. It has its sort of longers, I would say. There are some dead spots here and there, you might believe. But if you want to see another piece that culminates in one of these large variation type structures grafted onto a sonata form opening, then the Dohnányi Second Symphony is an excellent work that you might find attractive to explore. And like I said, one of the nice things about these talks, the sequels and prequels, is that you have a frame of reference. And, you really should be listening also to Beethoven's Last Piano Sonata. And I think it's fascinating to see the sonata structure translated into the orchestral medium and the different things composers do to justify their choices. Now, my favorite recording of the Beethoven, I have to be honest, is Claudio Arrau's on Philips, probably for his way with the trills. I mean, it is the most spiritual and evanescent performance. It just blows me away every time I hear it. But I know you'll all have yours and you'll tell me what they are. I think the important thing is to use this little exercise as a way to hear some fascinating music that you might not have encountered or even thought of. I mean, who thinks about Prokofiev's Second Symphony or Szymanowski's Second Symphony? And in connection with Beethoven, since they were written almost 100 years later, it's really wonderful. It's just wonderful. It's one of those things that as you begin to get more and more experienced listening to different works from different periods, you begin to see these correspondences and these influences and the fact that they're all just ready to hand. I mean, they're all just sitting there on recordings. We can just snag them whenever we want and listen to them whenever we want. It's the ultimate reason to keep on listening. So I hope you found this enjoyable, and I hope that you enjoy experimenting with these different pieces based on Beethoven's Last Sonata and the idea of huge variation movements as the linchpin for major, much later Second Symphonies. Thank you, and if you enjoyed this talk, do please subscribe to my YouTube channel. Take care.